Hey everyone, it is finally time for some more 2S battery performance testing results. Today I'm going to show you these three batteries by GNB, Team Blacksheep, and BetaFPV. Now all three of these batteries were new to the market at the very end of 2018. I got them right away, but it has taken me quite a while to get this information to you, so I apologize for that. The good news is I have now had lots of time to fly these batteries, so I'm going to give you the data and my own opinion about what it's like to fly with these batteries. If you're interested, I've already reviewed the performance of these other 2S batteries. There's a link to that video in the description down below. Real quick, I do want to thank TBS and BetaFPV. They sent me these batteries for testing, whereas the GNB batteries, I purchased these with my own money because I don't have any contacts at GNB. But regardless, I want you to know that I do not make any money on the success or failure of any of these products. I don't work for any of these companies. I just want to know what the performance was like, and now I'm happy to share that with you. Now I'm going to give you several pieces of information about these batteries, including my own opinions, but you should really come to your own conclusions about it, because my testing methods are not perfect, and I only have a handful of each of these different types of batteries to test. So it's quite possible that you could receive a battery that's better or worse than the ones that I have here. Take that into account, but I hope this is helpful for you. Alright, so these two batteries have exactly the same specifications. They're both 300 milliamp hour 2-cell batteries. They both claim an ADC continuous discharge, and they're both labeled as high voltage batteries, meaning that you can charge it to 4.35 volts per cell instead of the regular 4.2 volts per cell. This one only claims a 35 C rating. This is the BetaFPV, but it claims a larger capacity, 350 milliamp hours. Normally I wouldn't compare batteries of different capacities, but in this case I thought it was fair game because all three of these batteries have a very similar cost and weight. They even have a very similar flight time, and so these are batteries that you might be comparing against each other and wondering how they perform. Based just on the specifications, we would expect that these would excel at high current situations with much less sag because of the high C rating compared to this one. And in this case, that is in fact true. These batteries are really phenomenal at pumping out current. But these two batteries may not be the perfect solution for everyone. They're certainly not the lightest batteries in their class, nor do they have the highest capacity among 300 milliamp hour batteries. I'll get into that in a little bit. This BetaFPV battery doesn't claim to have such high discharge capability, and that's good because it certainly doesn't. In fact, I'm sorry to say, but I think the quality of this battery may actually be worse than the 300 milliamp hour battery that it replaced. This one is larger and heavier, but has a similar capacity because the voltage sag sets in earlier, and so the amount of the capacity that you can really use for flying ends up being similar to one of these batteries. Don't get me wrong, this battery is good enough to get out there and have a great time flying your 2S micro drone. I just don't think it's quite as good as its competition, but you don't have to take my word for it. Let's get into the numbers. I'm going to show you several graphs in just a minute, but if you prefer, a lot of the numbers are in this spreadsheet, and there's a link in the video description. This is actually the same spreadsheet from my last video, and I've simply added 3 new lines for these 3 batteries, so you can see all of the weights and measurements. To be able to compare these batteries, I'm going to break it down into several different categories, starting with convenience. By convenience, I mean how easy is it going to be to use on your quad? Is it going to just work? In my last video, I talked about how some batteries have really long wires or the wrong connector, so that might be a source of inconvenience. This time, I'm happy to say that they all have XT30, they all have nice short balance plugs, which I like, and they all fit in the Beta 75X tray. That means they'll also fit in the 75 Pro 2 and in other trays that are similar size. I've even got a Primo by Gnarly FPV. You can see the 3D printed part is going to hold that just fine. This has become a pretty standard size, and that is nice. Of these batteries, the tightest fit is this GNB. It is a tiny bit thicker. This one is also a really tight fit, so it might take a little bit more work to get them into the frame. That's a downside, but an upside. They're less likely to move in a crash. Now let's look at the weight. The top of the blue bar shows the weight of the lightest battery of each kind that I measured, and the thickness of the orange band on top shows you how much variation there is between the lightest and the heaviest for each type of battery. Out of these 3 batteries, the heaviest one is the 300 milliamp hour GNB battery, followed by the 350 milliamp hour BetaFPV, and the TBS battery is the lightest of the 3. Normally you would expect a battery with a larger capacity to be heavier, but there's more to the construction of a battery than just its milliamp hour capacity. These ADC batteries also have larger wires, and I assume they have larger tabs on the inside to match. All that extra copper is going to be important if you're pushing a lot of amps, but it definitely does add weight. I thought it'd be interesting to compare numbers against some of the batteries from my previous videos, so I pulled out these two as examples. This 300 milliamp hour BetaFPV battery is the predecessor to the 350 that we're looking at today, and this 45C 300 milliamp hour Nanotech battery was the highest performing battery in my last set of tests. As you can see, these batteries are significantly lighter than any of the three that we're testing today. To measure capacity, I decided to repeat exactly the same steps that I used in my last video. Basically, I had my charger and the batteries connected like this, charged to 4.2 volts per cell, and then discharged at a 2C rate at room temperature until it hit a cutoff of 3.3 volts per cell. This is a much slower discharge than you would get while flying, and it's just one way to measure the capacity. So don't look at these numbers as being important in and of themselves, but I think the comparison is interesting. When I repeat this test for the same battery, I get very reproducible results within about 2 milliamp hours. As you can see, the GNB and TBS batteries were not able to discharge as much as the larger BetaFPV battery. That's not too surprising in itself, but now compare that BetaFPV battery to the 300 milliamp hour batteries from my previous test. These two BetaFPV batteries discharged exactly the same amount in my test, despite having different capacities on the label. Now, both of these batteries also say 300 milliamp hour on the label, so you might be wondering why they discharge so much less than the other 350 milliamp hour batteries. And that's because both of these batteries are labeled as HV batteries. Anytime you see HV on the label, the capacity is the capacity that it would have when HV charged. That's not a sneaky thing, that's just how the labeling works. And both of these batteries actually list the watt-hour capacity as well. 0.3 amps at a nominal voltage of 7.6 volts gives you 2.28 watt-hours. So to be fair, here's the extra capacity you would get if you chose to HV charge these two batteries. This brings the GNB battery right up to the level of the other ones, but for some reason, the TBS battery did fall a little bit short in this test. I'm not sure why. I never really noticed a difference in capacity when flying, but I was able to reproduce this test, so this is the data that I have. Now let's talk about internal resistance. When you pump a lot of current through a battery, the internal resistance is one of the factors that causes voltage sag and causes some of your power to be lost in the form of heat. So lower resistance is better. Again, I measured them on this charger at room temperature, which is not the same as you would see in the air. The exact testing method definitely affects the numbers, so please don't compare my numbers to anybody else's, but do compare them to each other. Here are the 80C batteries. The resistance is measured in milliohms per cell, and again, the blue bar shows you the value of the best cell that was measured, and the orange band shows you the variation. If you took the average, these two battery types had very similar overall resistance, although there was more variation in the GNB battery. As you can see, the BetaFPV battery had significantly higher internal resistance than either of those two. It also had higher resistance than the 35C battery that it replaced. And for comparison, here's the 45C Nanotech. Again, this was the best performing battery in my last set of tests, and you can see that it does also have a lower internal resistance. In fact, the resistance of this battery is very similar to the two batteries on the left. All three of these have excellent performance and very similar internal resistance. Having the same internal resistance doesn't mean that they have the same performance. But performance in the air is actually really hard to quantify and show in a video, and that's why I saved it for last. I ended up doing two different sets of tests, one on the bench and one in the field. For the bench test, I decided to repeat exactly the same steps as my last video, so you can watch that video for more detail. Basically, I had this 75X strapped to a tripod, and I had a custom throttle curve so that I could run it at 40% throttle for 5 seconds, and then 100% throttle for 5 seconds, repeating that until the voltage dropped below 3.3 volts per cell for the first time. If you record the voltage from the OSD and plot it over time, it looks like this. This time we're starting with the BetaFPV 350, and you can see this first dip is 10 seconds into the flight. That's after 5 seconds of 40% throttle and then 5 seconds of 100% throttle. After lowering the throttle for 5 seconds, you can see the voltage goes back up and the pattern repeats. Now, as the capacity of the battery gets used up, the voltage continues to decline, and this test ended at 2 minutes and 10 seconds. This kind of bench test is really hard on the batteries. Most people when flying aren't going to push the batteries this hard, so 2 minutes and 10 seconds is actually respectable, but it's not the best. Now take a look at the TBS battery. This is remarkable performance. This time the initial burst only took us down to 3.65 volts, but then recovered to 3.9. As we continue to hit it with bursts of 100% throttle, you can see that the voltage is changing by less than 1/10 of a volt per cell most of the time. A battery like this is going to give you a very consistent feel on the throttle response, even at the end of a big move. It didn't drop below 3.5 volts at all until 2 minutes and 10 seconds into the test, and even then it stayed above 3.4 all the way up into the end at 2 minutes and 30 seconds. As you can see, that slow discharge test that I did earlier was not the full story. In that test, the BetaFPV 350 looked like it had a higher capacity than this TBS 300, but as you can see under heavy load, the BetaFPV battery actually gives up sooner and the TBS battery holds on. Now for this test, I did not HV charge any of these batteries. The TBS battery started at 4.2 volts per cell, and as we've already seen, an HV battery only has the capacity printed on the label when it's actually HV charged. If this battery was HV charged, I think we can expect the graph to be even higher and end even later. The G&B battery also did really well in this test. In fact, the performance of the G&B and TBS batteries are so similar, I think it's within the error of measurement. And that's consistent with my own flying experience. If I was just flying normally with either of these batteries, I couldn't tell you which is which. Now let's compare them to the 45C Nanotech from my earlier video. I did not retest the Nanotech, but I did follow exactly the same procedure, and you can see the results here in green. As you can see, this Nanotech battery had a lower voltage for most of the flight, and the dips in voltage were more severe, although it did manage to last a little bit longer. The Nanotech battery was good, especially for its weight, but these new batteries do provide better performance under heavy load. It's also interesting to compare the BetaFPV battery to its predecessor, so here you can see both of them. The newer 350 mAh battery did better initially, but then they start to perform very similarly, and the older 300 mAh battery definitely lasted longer. Alright, take away all the old batteries. Here you can see just the 3 new batteries from today's test. Now I wanted to make sure that these results were not a fluke, and so I swapped out these batteries for different ones and repeated this entire set of tests, and here's the results. In the second test, the numbers were not all exactly the same, but the relative performance of these batteries held true. And that brings us to my last set of tests, which is also the most demanding. I charged these batteries back up to 4.2 volts per cell and took them out into the field where I flew my 75X on continuous 100% throttle. Check out this speed. It's pretty impressive for a little 2S whoop with 40mm props and a 300 mAh battery. In this test, the voltage of the BetaFPV battery dropped almost immediately, but then it held firm for the rest of the flight and lasted all the way up to 1 minute and 40 seconds of continuous maximum throttle. That is very respectable. The TBS battery maintained a higher voltage throughout, although it did end sooner. But the winner of this particular test is clear. It's the G&B battery. Check out this performance. It maintained a higher voltage throughout, declined nice and gradually, and ended at 1 minute and 40 seconds, matching the BetaFPV battery. And this is without an HV charge. So why do these 3 batteries have different performance when we've already seen that the internal resistance of the cells is almost the same? The difference, I think, is the conductors. These ones have larger wires, and they almost certainly have larger tabs and plates on the inside. That's going to help them carry more current with less heat. As the heat in the metals increases, so does the resistance, and that is one of the things that causes voltage sag. I have definitely observed that these 2 batteries come down much cooler than my other 300s when I push them hard. This G&B battery is really beefy, and I think that helps it to hold up under continuous high throttle. But in all of the other cases, these 2 batteries had about the same performance, and this one is a little bit lighter. In conclusion, I will say that I'm very impressed with both of these batteries. If you have an amp-hungry build or you just want to push performance to the next level, then I would recommend either of these batteries for your use. On the other hand, if you have a very small build or you fly in confined spaces, then you may not be using enough amps for these batteries to give you the full benefit. In that case, you might want to consider one of the lighter weight alternatives. As we wrap up here, I just want to say I think it is awesome that batteries like this even exist. It was just over a year ago when my friends and I were building 2S whoops like this. This is the one that inspired the Beta 75X, and that was awesome, but it was really hard to find components back then. Most of the companies that made components in this size were making them for small toys, and we're not taking performance seriously in this size category, and that has completely changed thanks to the popularity of 2S whoops. We have so much more selection now in components and batteries, and pushing the performance to new levels all the time, and I think that is awesome. Hope this information is helpful for you. If it is, I hope that you'd like and subscribe and tell your friends. That helps to get the word out into the community. And so I thank you for that. I've got more content coming, so stay tuned. In the meantime, happy flying.